All right, guys, good morning. Just a few minutes until it's really class time, but welcome back already up and at 'em. So good to see you guys. Okay. Hope you guys had a good weekend. It's nice to be into March now. Welcome back. Hi, Ghazi, Jesse, Delilah. Good morning, everybody. Cam, Nicole, Monica. Good to see you guys. Good morning, everybody. Ashley, Jonathan, Andres, Ashley, Leslie, Caleb. How's it going? PG. Just another minute or so. Hey, John, Daniel, Ryan, Roheen. Nice to see everybody. Hey there. Good to see you guys. Natalie, Dan, all the rest. Welcome back. Isabel, Fernando. Nice. Okay, guys, so it's pretty much approximately 8:30. So I know that it's early and we still have a few to arrive, but for now anyways, welcome back. Good to see everybody. Hi, Roxana, Veronica. And how was my weekend? It was nice. You know, I have a lot of grading going on right now, so a lot of it was just doing that. But I also just took some time to go on some nice runs and just kind of chill and relax. So I enjoy March. It's my birthday month. I like the change of weather to spring. I like it when we spring forward and get a little extra daylight. So I'm happy for those things. But yeah, welcome back, everybody. And I see those that are just arriving. So welcome to the meeting again. Just get comfortable and get your viewing set up correct, and we'll be starting in a minute. Let me just say this. I did send off the notification on Sunday night that I had finished the grading of the first quiz. So I'm going through all the requests for grades that I've received so far to my inbox, and I'm just answering those messages. My policy is to always try to get back replies within 48 hours from when the message was sent to me. So I had a pretty busy day yesterday of teaching. That kind of delayed some of my responses, but I'm going to get to more of them today. Anyway, just so we're all clear, in that message, I just notified you that I did finish grading the first quiz, and I'm ready to just answer anyone's email request for grades. I like to do that because then I can provide personalized feedback to individuals, and I also maintain a kind of connection to the student. It kind of also, I think, establishes good habits for you, checking for your grades and seeking out the information. So anybody who is curious about how they did on the first quiz, just please send me a message and I'll hit you with a reply within 48 hours of when I get it. I just give myself a little 48-hour window because of how many classes I teach and how many emails that I do have, but not to worry, I'll certainly get to anyone's message. And if you sent me something either Sunday night or yesterday, don't worry, it's going to be a reply coming to you either later tonight or tomorrow morning. So anyways, now we're all good on that. We're done with the first homework, the first quiz. Those that are looking for their scores on either assignment or any comments can simply just ask me by email. You know my email address. It's rvulich@fullerton.edu. So I'm checking those messages every day, and I try to be as timely as I can be. The next thing that's coming up is next week on Thursday, we have the midterm exam. So before the midterm, the plan this week is we're going to finish up Chapter 4 in our class. We have 2 lectures on Chapter 4 today and Thursday. And then I'll distribute over the weekend the study guide for the review session next week. And on Tuesday next week, we'll have a review session where we'll go over the whole study guide. And then next Thursday, that's when you guys will have your midterm exam. So, you know, the class keeps moving forward. And the next thing that you'll have on the horizon is the midterm exam of, what is that, Thursday, March the 11th, okay? So just keeping you apprised of some key dates and just reminding you to please request those scores for your quiz if you would like it. Okay, so we're all clear on that. If there's any kind of questions about anything, schedule, the class, any of the material or topics, just please let me know while we're all together in the chat here. I'm always happy to take any kind of questions or comments of any type. So then, with that, we have to just finish a couple of last leftover notes from Chapter 3. So when we were here on Thursday last week, we almost finished Chapter 3, but there's a couple of rhetorical devices at the tail end that we didn't get to speak about. So now I'm just going to talk about that with you guys. Nicole, you say, is the midterm going to be like how the quiz was? Yes, that's true. It is going to be similar to that quiz. It's just going to have an expanded list of questions. So I think the quiz was 17 questions. The midterm will be closer to maybe like 27 or something like that. So in the high 20s. And the point value of each question on the midterm will be 4 points rather than 3. So 3 by 17 is 50. And I think like 4 by 25, that's pretty much how I'm going to run the midterm. And that'll be out of 100. But then I'll double the point value because the class has 20% of the value given to the midterm. So that's how it will be. Yeah. And we will have a thorough review session where we'll list all the different key concepts and definitions for you to know about. And that way you'll be fully prepared, hopefully, for your midterm next week. Okay, so good, thank you. Now let me just return to our notes for a moment as we finish off the last piece of Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 was last week, and as you guys maybe remember, it was all about language and communication. And we reached the very last part of the notes there where we were talking about rhetorical devices. So I just have a couple more of those to go over with you. Rhetorical devices. So rhetorical devices are basically ways that language can be used to psychologically persuade other people without using reason. And so a lot of times people find rhetorical devices to be something that shapes a person's view without appeal to rational argument. And because of that, they're sometimes to be treated with a little bit of suspicion or skepticism. You know, sometimes rhetorical devices prevent you from coming to your own conclusions, and they try and shape your views for you. So one of them that we talked about was euphemism. That one we did cover last week. So I'm not going to write the whole definition again, but I'm listing the term euphemism. Maybe someone here in the chat could just quickly remind us, what does the word euphemism mean? What's a euphemism? And once we kind of warm up and remember what that is, then we can continue through a couple of actual other rhetorical devices. So euphemism, what type of thing is that? It's a way of using language to shape a person's perspective on something, but how does it go? What is a euphemism? If anyone knows, let me hear in the chat a little quick description of the concept. So yeah, let me know. To do a euphemism, to use a euphemism is to do what? That's for you to just let me know. It would be the very last note. If you're a good, careful note taker, it would be the very last thing from the notes that you have from prior Thursday. Okay, so Delilah, replacing a negative or neutral word with a positive one in order to sugarcoat the truth. Very good. Yes, correct. Can anyone think of an example of a term that is a euphemistic label for something? Also, yes, good, Gabriel. That's the right definition. When you replace a negative word or a neutral word, I would say, with a more positive sounding one to sugarcoat something. You'd put sugar quote, but yes, to sugarcoat, like, you know, to coat something in sugar. It's a metaphor, like to make something that otherwise would be bitter to the taste more palatable to the taste, right? So kind of that's just a way of referring to the idea of sugarcoating something in language. But yeah, what would be an example of a euphemistic term or label for something? Maybe someone could throw an example out there. Because, I mean, there's millions of examples of this. We actually deal with them all the time. Hi, AJ, good morning. AJ, what's the euphemism? Give me an example. Good morning, though. Nice to see you. But yeah, that's a question on the table. Anyone that can throw one out at me, that would be awesome. So making something sound better than it is, basically, with the way that you describe it in language. She's in between jobs. That's a good one, Violetta, right. So someone got fired, and you might say, oh, well, I'm just in between jobs right now. Or I'm fun employed. I've heard that one, but I don't even know if that's necessarily anything people really say. You might say when you got fired, canned, sacked, I was let go. You know, instead of the workforce slashing its workforce, no, we just right-sized our workforce. You know, we got it to the right size. So there's many ways in language that you can make a thing that's otherwise not as nice sounding sound better and more pleasant. So dying, right, AJ? He has passed. He's passed away. He's in a better place. Sounds a lot better than, you know, he has experienced death, and you know, now he's dead. Okay, so those are all good examples. Just quickly touching base on euphemism. Now, what's a dysphemism? That's the opposite. So anyway, one last thing about euphemism, well, about all the rhetorical devices. In general, you should be alert to those. You should be aware that sometimes in marketing and advertising, in political speech, in sometimes media messages, and just everyday conversation, people try to shape your views or shield their own views from critique by using euphemisms to describe things. So you have to sometimes see through that as a critical thinker to come to the correct conclusions. Don't allow the way language is being used to illegitimately shape your view about something. So if someone told you that they were selling you a vintage car, you might want to think a moment about whether that is just a euphemistic way of saying that it's really old, and then do your own research. Okay, so dysphemism. What's a dysphemism? It's the opposite. So with a dysphemism, it's to replace a positive or a neutral word with a more negative sounding one in order to create the opposite effect, to create disapproval. Okay, so dysphemism, replacing a positive or neutral term with a negative one in order to create disapproval. So sometimes language can try to shape our views in a negative direction about something, and this is the way of dysphemism. So say someone is smoking cigarettes, right? It's just a tobacco product. They're smoking it, they're using it. But if a person really hates cigarettes or doesn't like the idea of smoking, then they might use a different word to refer to those cigarettes. I don't know if you've ever heard a word like this, but does anyone have a sense of what I'm hinting at here? What are you doing over there with those, let's not call them cigarettes because that's just too neutral, cancer stick, right? There you go, Nicole. That's a heavily dysphemistic way of referring to the cigarette. Now, cigarettes are not good for you, and they do have all kinds of carcinogens in them, right? But calling them cancer sticks is perhaps a little bit beyond the pale. It's trying to let the person know what you're doing to yourself is likely going to cause you like a fatal illness. And so it gets the point across that you don't like those things, but at the same time, it's not a neutral way of describing it. So that's one case. Here's another one. There's a tax policy that our country has, which is called the estate tax. It's sometimes also called the inheritance tax. And basically, it's just a policy which says if you have a sufficient amount of wealth, then if you pass away, or I guess die, anyway, when you end your life or when your life is over, the wealth that you transmit to the next of kin and your offspring, the government gets to collect some of it as a taxation on the transfer of the estate. This is only for certain people who have sufficient wealth. So you have to have like an estate worth several $1 million. But anyway, there's many opponents of the policy, and those that don't like it don't refer to it as the estate tax because it just sounds like a neutral term. Instead, they'll call it the death tax. And that's supposed to evoke to your mind, like, scary and dark thoughts about how you're going to be taxed just for dying. Can't you be at least left to rest in peace and die peacefully? But no, you'll even be taxed for that. So anyway, I mean, you can't really have a rational assessment of the policy, whether it's good or bad, if you have this kind of heavily dysphemistic label hanging over it. And I mean, there are valid reasons, for example, for the state to impose some kind of tax on the transfer of wealth to the next of kin. But you won't see that if you just call it death tax. I don't know. Let's see. Here's another one. So, like, there were methods of treatment that were applied to detainees in U.S. custody, like in Guantanamo Bay prison and stuff, like international detainees that we had apprehended in different theaters of war and stuff like that. And so many, international humanitarian monitors and legal arguments have been produced that some of the treatment given to some of those detainees amounted to torture, like waterboarding people, putting them in stress positions, and all kinds of other terrible behavior. So torture, well, I guess I'm actually switching back to the other case. I don't know what's happening with my mind right now, but torture, I guess a euphemism could be enhanced interrogation tactics. But I guess one person's euphemism is another person's dysphemism. You could say that enhanced interrogation tactics are being given the dysphemistic label of torture, according to those that defended the policy. So there you see an example of how sometimes the use of language can shield a position from critique or try to deflect critical analysis. Let me find some more examples from the book here while we're just talking about that. So chapter 3 at the very end. So yeah, we've got here dysphemisms, death tax for inheritance tax. Okay, so suppose that someone is just very devoutly religious. They're very serious about their religion and their practice, and so someone calls them, instead of just devout, like fanatical or obsessed. Maybe, so sometimes you want to find a dysphemistic label for a political position that you oppose. So instead of calling somebody pro-choice, the dysphemism would be like, oh, this person's anti-life. Or on the other side of the spectrum, this person's not pro-life, but anti-choice. So be alert to the way that language sometimes tries to shape our views without appeal to argument or reason. And those are some cool examples. So now we move to the next. We've heard about euphemism and dysphemism. There's just a few more rhetorical devices left over from chapter 3. There's also just sarcasm. Okay, so sarcasm, something I think a lot of people, especially young people, are kind of familiar with. What it is just the use of ridicule, irony, or insult to deflect critical analysis or to make light of someone or something. So okay, so the use of irony, ridicule, or insult to deflect critical analysis or to make light of something or someone. So the characteristic format of a sarcastic comment, it's like you can tell by the tone of voice, or if it's just a written comment, like in text, then you can tell also by the context that it's written in or the language that is used. And oftentimes when people speak or write sarcastically, they will say or write something which denotatively has the exact opposite meaning of what they are intending to convey. So like, suppose that you had a friend over at someone's house and they just kind of clumsily knocked over a very expensive like vase that had been sitting in a nice area of the house. And let's suppose this vase is a precious family heirloom that's been held in their family for like 100 years, given by the great-grandfather or something, purchased by the great-grandmother. Anyway, it's a valuable old item, an antique piece, and just a friend that's there turning around inadvertently hits their elbow on it and knocks it to the ground and it shatters. So a reaction to that, a sarcastic comment could be like, oh, wow, smooth move, man, like, great. You know, so like it's stated as a compliment, but obviously the force conveyed by the statement is you did something clumsy, you know, sloppy, and you know, you're basically accident prone, but you're complimenting them sarcastically, like, wow, smooth move. Someone does something that you think is really foolish, and you're like, genius, wow, that's amazing, smart one. Can anybody else think of possible examples? I mean, sarcasm is something that all of us use or have used, and sometimes we're the target of sarcasm as well. So maybe anyone has an idea about that. You know, like, oh, someone gives you like a really boring story and you're like, wow, you know, something like that. So you kind of feign interest in it, and the sarcasm is kind of dripping off of your comments, so the person kind of knows that you're making a little bit of fun and trying to maybe ridicule a little bit. Anyone else have some examples, just while we're on the subject of the sarcasm? And then I'll move on from that, maybe if you have something. You know, you're in a really boring situation, you're like, this is fun, et cetera, et cetera. But don't let me give you all the examples with all these students here. Okay, yeah, like a yeah, right kind of comment. You know, so you're like giving a confirmation by saying, oh, yeah, right. But you actually, by means of the tone of your voice, are making it clear through implication that you don't really think they're right. All right, so I mean, there's probably a few more examples. Anyone want to throw another one out there? I'm surprised. Okay, so Alicia, good morning. Yes, I see that you're here. Alicia, can you think of a sarcastic comment? I'm trying to ask the students here for examples and see if anyone's got a good one. I think mine are kind of generic. I'm just like, oh, smooth move when someone breaks something, or like, great job when someone messes up, or like, that was, wow, you're nice job, Einstein, when someone did something really dumb. But I guess the examples are sufficient to carry the point across. It's just that, you know, with a big group of you guys, oh, wow, I love it. Yeah, so in a sarcastic tone of voice, letting someone know that you don't like the situation you're in or the thing that you're being presented with. Okay, cool. So sarcasm. About sarcasm, last word. You know, as we like to sometimes make fun and just make light of things, it's okay to use sarcasm. But the problem I find, your dad, that's funny, walk much when you trip or fall. Yeah, like, it can be good humor, and if you're in the right company and everyone's kind of in on the joke, it's all right. But the problem I find is that sometimes people fall back on sarcasm so much that they start to lose their own credibility, and it's hard for you to take a person seriously if everything that comes out of their mouth or that they write is written tongue-in-cheek or half-jokingly, you know? So sometimes people will even sometimes say like offensive things, right? Like if they post something online, they want to be edgy, and so they say something a little bit, you know, on the border or even straight up offensive, and then later on maybe someone calls them to account, like, why did you say that? And then the typical defense is like, come on, can't you take a joke? I was just joking, I was being sarcastic. The problem is, though, there's a time for being sarcastic and there's also a time for being serious. And if you always have this lurking right beneath the surface, you're ready to just start joking and, you know, trolling people with sarcastic comments, then after a while it undermines your own credibility and effectiveness as a communicator, because people want to know when you really mean what you're saying versus when you're joking. And I also figure that sometimes the sarcastic person, they lose sight of when they themselves are serious. Like, was I really meaning that when I wrote it, or am I just now claiming as a sort of rationalization that I was being sarcastic? So, you know, try your best to be serious and straightforward and direct in the way that you provide information to people. When it's sarcasm time, that's fine, but don't overdo it, because if it becomes a second habit and it becomes your second nature, then after a while, I think it puts you on a slippery slope to being like less and less honest and truthful. Okay, yeah, exactly, Alicia. And especially nowadays that we're all stuck at home, you know, it's even harder sometimes to do just a written form of communication to detect sarcasm. You know, someone could write something and it seems straight up sexist, racist, you know, or like bigoted in some way. And, you know, they might claim, well, I meant it sarcastically, but without hearing the tone of voice or knowing the broader person's characteristic traits, it's hard to determine. So, you know, make it easy for people sometimes to know when you're being serious and when you're not. Okay, so that's sarcasm. Then the next one mentioned is just hyperbole. Hyperbole, a word that maybe some of you learned or heard of before, but let's just go over it again. It's when one uses exaggeration or overstatement to basically distort the truth. Okay, so exaggeration, making things seem bigger, better, grander than they really are in the way that you describe something in language. Sometimes it's innocent enough. Someone will say like, oh man, that lecture was just so boring. I was literally dying, sitting there having to listen to this. Well, no, the person wasn't literally dying, but when saying that, I guess you get a sense of how boring the experience might have been for the person. And that's innocent enough, and that's just kind of all fun and games. But sometimes when you're exaggerating the facts, there's a lot more at stake. Like, for example, what if you've exaggerated certain aspects of your work history in a job application or in an early phase of the dating relationship? You're exaggerating or being hyperbolic, overstating facts about your relationship history or your professional career. Sometimes people like to embellish the facts to make things seem a little better, but it's definitely either stretching the truth or straight up false. So honesty usually is the best policy. You don't have to rely on bold overstatements to get your points across or to get people to respect or recognize you. And I find, again, that with hyperbole, if it becomes a habit and you're always like a serial exaggerator, you always make things out to bigger than they really are, then just like with sarcasm, you can tend to become an unserious person that loses credibility. There's an old story called The Boy Who Cried Wolf, and probably some of you remember this children's story. Basically, this is a kid who would always cry out that a wolf was coming, and usually there never was. So people after a while kind of figured this person's exaggerating, and then when something really did happen, no one would believe the person. So you want your credibility to be there when it's important and when it matters. So you don't want to undermine and erode your own credibility by having a track record of exaggeration and overstatement and people associating that with your character. You may think in the moment, this is to my benefit because if someone believes this exaggeration, I will appear better. But over time, people usually can figure out what's true and false. And when you're detected as someone that exaggerates, it won't be to your advantage. So anyway, hyperbole, sometimes maybe it's fun and games, but we shouldn't do it overly much. So there we go. There's also Chicken Little. I remember that story. I was just thinking of children's stories as I mentioned this to you. Wasn't that the one where the chicken said, oh, the sky's falling, and it was always like an exaggeration? I'm not sure how the story ended, though, so that's why I guess I didn't want to refer to that one. But maybe some of you remember your old children's stories. What ended up happening with Chicken Little? Did the sky fall eventually and like no one believed him, or was it just... Anyway, well, I'll research that one again on my own, I guess. Okay, so just one more rhetorical device, and the last one here is just simply deception. Now, with deception, there's basically two possible kinds. There's passive and there's active deception. So I'll just put them with little Arabic numerals. 1, active deception, and 2, passive deception. So active deception is basically lying. It's when you deliberately say something false in order to mislead. So active deception, when you deliberately state a falsehood in order to mislead someone or some audience. And then passive deception is also deceptive, but instead of saying something false, this is the case of withholding the truth, so not providing the facts. So this is withholding the truth. Passive deception, withholding the truth. Sometimes they call this a lie of omission. So instead of saying an outright falsehood, you simply don't disclose the truth or reveal it to people who would be in a position to know. So, like, for example, active deception. Say that somebody was cheating on their partner in a marriage, and the question comes up, have you ever cheated on me? And the person says, no, I've never done that. Of course not. In that case, when they say no, they haven't, they know that's false, and they deliberately say this false thing so that the other person doesn't figure out or understand the facts. Deliberately saying a falsehood is deception. Sometimes we pass on false information when we're unaware that it's false, and that's not deception as much as misinformation. So, like, if somebody said to me, like, gave me a rumor, you know, a bomb went off at Cal State Fullerton. Did you hear that? And I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy. So I text my friend and I'm like, did you hear this bomb went off? Suppose that I was the one that was already being hit with false information from my initial friend, and I just passed on the same false information to someone else. That's misinformation, but it's not deception because I sincerely believed it when I told the person. On the other hand, real active deception, I mean, that's bad enough. You want to try and not be misinformed and pass on false info, even if it's unintended. But at the same time, active deception is when you're doing that on purpose. You're like, you want the person to be misinformed, so you deliberately say what you think is not true. Passive deception, though, would be withholding the truth or facts. So instead of saying, I've never cheated, and the person has, you just never bring it up, and it never comes up. Pass the salt while you're just having dinner, and you're thinking in your mind, I'm never going to tell them what I've done. So some people think that passive deception is not as bad because it's not technically saying something false, but in many cases, people are still entitled to the facts, and withholding them can still be preventing them from getting to the truth. Like if on a job interview, you lie about your prior work history, that would be active deception. You say, I worked a job and you didn't work there, or you say you worked there longer or something, or that, you know, the conditions for you leaving were amicable with your employer. You could lie and embellish your work history, but you could also just not tell the employer some of the jobs that you did work. You could like leave out certain information about your prior work history, and that would also be deceptive. So in life, sometimes you don't want people to know the truth because you're trying to conceal yourself from accountability or whatever, but it's usually best to be honest because the truth comes out one way or the other. So do your best to be honest as much as you possibly can. And we see that there's these two different types of deception. Okay, guys, so with that in place, I'm moving on to chapter 4. Sorry about Peachy, you know, she just kind of makes herself a big part of the meetings, but Peach, girl, I need you to lay down. Okay, good girl. So anyway, let's talk about chapter 4. That's the next chapter of the book. And I mean, it seems clear to me. I'm going to have to put her in the next room. Sorry, guys. 1 second, okay? Okay, yeah, sorry. I mean, it's usually all good with Peachy, as you know, but sometimes she just wants too much attention. So we're now on to chapter 4. Chapter 4, new chapter for our book, is all about knowledge and the limitations of human knowledge. So that's the heading. That's the header. Knowledge and its limits. Okay, so at the beginning of some of these chapters in the book, there will be a little reference to some. Oh, thanks, Ashley. She's really a good cat. Well, she's back. I can't put this girl away. Let me just try to put her in my lap, and then she'll be happy. Okay, so knowledge and its limits. At the beginning of many of these different chapters in the book, there'll be a reference to some kind of real-world facts to give you a little bit of, I guess, the sense of relevance that these lessons have to everyday life. Like at the beginning of chapter 3, there was mention of the Benghazi scandal of 2012. At the beginning of chapter 1, they talked about those social science experiments that give some insight into the value of critical thinking. So in the beginning of chapter 4, they refer to some famous cases of medical error. Okay, medical mistakes. Sometimes in the medical field, mistakes can be made due to human error and cognitive error. And when it happens, it can sometimes have devastating results. So one example mentioned was in 1995 at a university hospital in Florida. There was this man, Willie King, and he was supposed to have his leg amputated. Unfortunately, he had an infection in the leg that caused gangrene, and therefore, to save his life, they would have to cut that leg so it wouldn't infect the rest of his bloodstream. So the surgical team prepped him for the procedure, and he was fully anesthetized. But what happened was they got confused and accidentally operated on the wrong leg. So they actually amputated the healthy leg. And now that's a terrible result, right? Because they still had to amputate the other unhealthy leg. So he became a double amputee, therefore completely losing, all physical ability from the legs down. That was a case of medical mistake, totally preventable just due to human error. Another case, the famous actor Dennis Quaid, he had newborn twins that had a blood condition, and so they prescribed them this blood thinning medication called heparin, but they accidentally administered a dose that was 1,000 times beyond the required amount, and it almost killed both of the little newborn twins. So, this is just scratching the surface. There's all kinds of medical errors that happen. Not often, we hope, but it's possible and it's not unprecedented. Now, what to think about these cases? You might be thinking, okay, well, these are just highly irregular. These must be totally incompetent, workers or staff that made these mistakes. But actually, the real lesson to learn is that even highly trained professionals in very important fields where life and death is on the line can still make mental mistakes that lead to these kind of errors. So if that's possible even in the most highly trained and professional fields, then so much more often is it possible with each of us in our everyday lives. That means we have to do our best to try and monitor ourselves for the possibility of making cognitive errors and mental mistakes. Errors in the processing of information, human error, is the #1 leading cause of medical mistakes. So, precautions were taken after these accidents, like new protocols were developed, double safety officers, computer monitors backing all the information up. But again, it's always possible to make mistakes even in these highly trained and specialized fields where there's so much at stake. So good critical thinking requires that we evaluate evidence carefully, that we interpret information correctly, and we are aware of the possibility of cognitive errors so that we avoid jumping to the wrong conclusions or taking the wrong decisions. So this is a chapter about knowledge, and we're going to try and talk about it all top to bottom. The first thing I guess we'll do is just give a definition of knowledge itself. You might be surprised to know that the word knowledge actually has a kind of consensus definition that we've inherited from the ancient Greeks. Thousands of years ago, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they discussed the idea of knowledge, and there is actually a dominant interpretation of it that has pretty much remained unchanged until present day. And that is this. So knowledge, what it is. By the way, for me, teaching on the topic of knowledge, I'm very interested in that. I have a special interest in it because that was kind of my emphasis as a grad student in philosophy. So epistemology is one major branch of philosophy. They call that the theory of knowledge or the study of knowledge. And so that's kind of my topic, and that's why I even find this even more enjoyable than some of the other subjects, even though it's all quite interesting. So back to this, knowledge, what it is. Knowledge is considered to be a justified true belief. So to be more specific, it's information that we believe, which is true, and for which we have justification. So I'll write it here. Information that we believe, which is true, and for which we have justification. So that's the definition right there, and there's 3 main ingredients or parts to the definition: truth, belief, and justification. So true, believed, and justification. In the way that philosophers and epistemologists talk about this definition, there's oftentimes a little acronym that is given to sort of simplify it, and that is the following acronym, which I'll write up here. K. It's kind of like a formula in math almost. K standing for knowledge is equivalent to, it equals JTB, where these 3 letters, JTB, each stand for one of these 3 criteria: justification, truth. Sorry there. Truth, belief. All right, so knowledge is JTB, justified, true belief. So we have to now actually go a little bit deeper into this concept of justification, truth, and belief. But we've already got a head start because we talked about two of those terms earlier in the semester. So I want to help you remember those things. So with your help, let me ask, what is it when a statement is true? Who remembers this? For a sentence to be true, what basically it has to be the situation for a sentence to be true? Like if I told you I'm wearing a watch, I hope you can see that's true. So given that example and our prior discussions, maybe you can clue us in and just inform us. What does the word true mean? If a sentence is true, this means what about that statement? Quick question, so let me know in the chat. We're touching base with the word truth again. And so that's the current question on the table. What does this word mean by definition? Truth, to have a true sentence. Okay, very good. So Grace, you're telling me that it's when a statement matches the facts of reality. And that's correct, yes. So a true sentence or statement is a statement that mirrors or reflects what the facts are of reality. So in saying that I'm wearing a watch, I'm saying something that is a fact. If I say to you that I'm wearing a hat, this is a statement, but it doesn't align with what's real because I'm not wearing a hat, in fact. So facts can match the statement, and when they do, it's a true statement, and it's correct. And if you say something or write something which is out of alignment with what's true, and I shouldn't use the word in its own definition, that's a circular definition, but anyway, when we have a statement that does not correspond to reality, then that's a falsehood. Okay, so next question, belief. We say that truth is when a sentence matches the facts. So what is the word belief then? To have a belief in a sentence is kind of piggybacks on the first term, truth, but let me know. If I believe a sentence, like I believe that the Earth is the third planet from the sun, or that the Earth is a sphere, or that, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. If I have a belief in any of these things, then what does this mean? To believe a sentence is to just what? Like, do you believe that, I don't know, that the coronavirus is real or what? Well, act of mind, yeah, but we need a little more detail though, Sky. It's an act of mind. What specific act is it? To believe a sentence, like do you believe that I have a cat? Or do you believe that the Eiffel Tower is in France? I'm giving you examples, but these are not statements. I'm asking a question. What's the definition of belief? So Roxana, you told us the right answer for truth. Truth is when what the sentence says matches the facts of reality. So to believe a sentence, please let me know. What is the definition? It is an act of mind, Sky, but you have to say a little more. Like, what particular act of mind is it? Because there's lots of acts of mind. I mean, I could just imagine things. That doesn't mean I believe them. I could just right now imagine a purple cow is on the moon, and that's my mind, but I don't believe there is a purple cow on the moon. So maybe that will help add a little more content. Okay, so Alyssa, when someone thinks a sentence is true, that's correct, right? So if you think a sentence is true, you believe it. And of course, people can have different beliefs. One person can believe that Santa Claus exists, and another person cannot believe that same statement to be true. But whatever you think is true, whatever you think are the facts, those are your beliefs. So like if a person believes that the earth is flat, for example, then they take the statement the earth is flat to correctly represent reality. Okay, so very good. So those are two of the components for knowledge. You have to think something's true, and by the way, it has to actually be true. So you have to get it right. You have to have it correct. But then justification is the third piece, and that's something that we have to be clear about. So what do you think is justification? Now I'm not asking you to remember old notes, but just use common sense and maybe logic of your own or your own prior vocabulary. Like, what do you think it means to have a justified belief? So if I say my belief that the earth is round is justified. What does it mean to have a belief that is justified as opposed to not being justified? So a justified belief, what status does it have over and beyond an unjustified belief? Because you can have beliefs that are not justified, and you can have beliefs that are. So what do you think it means when it has that status of being justified? If you have a justified belief, any guess? Okay, so that's good, Gabriel. To have evidence that backs up the belief, that's correct. Perfect. So let me write that down one time. You've already seen definition of knowledge here. I'll leave the acronym up there above. And now I'm going to create space for this note about what the definition of justification is. So justification is when you have good reasons or good evidence to support, to back up your belief. So having good evidence / reasons, pretty much the same thing, to support your belief. So now, the definition of knowledge is claiming this, that for you to have knowledge, knowledge exists when all three of these conditions are met. When a person thinks that something is true, when it actually is true, and when they have good reasons or evidence to support that belief. If all three of these conditions are satisfied, then that individual has knowledge of the given proposition or sentence. But if even one of them is off and not met, then it's not knowledge. So you can't have 2 out of 3 or 1 out of 3. They all have to be there for a person to really have knowledge. So let me try and make that intuitive by working through some quick examples with you. Okay, so let's say this. Dr. Vulich is 10 feet tall. Is it possible for a person to have knowledge of that statement? Just think about it in common sense terms. Could a person know that me, your professor, could a person know that I am 10 feet tall in height? Is that a possibility or no? Is that something that is eligible to even be knowledge? The statement that I'm 10 feet tall. Let me know what your answer is. Could it be knowledge or not? Okay, so Sky and Violetta, we have some problems already. What are you saying? You think that it's possible to know that I am 10 feet tall? Why do you say that? Why do you think that's possible for someone to know? And Nicole, you're saying no, which is actually the correct answer. It's not. You cannot know. Nobody could ever know that I'm 10 feet tall for an obvious reason. Why not? So I'm just going to tell you, no, you can't know that. Why is it not possible to know that I'm 10 feet tall? Let's just think of a clear reason why that's not eligible for knowledge. Because it is not true. Exactly, Dan. You can't know something that just isn't true. I'm not 10 feet tall, and no one has ever been 10 feet tall. No human being. So it's not something that is possible for anybody to know. Now, Sky and Violetta and others, maybe that had that same reaction of yes, maybe what you're thinking is something else. So a person could never know this. Well, logically possible doesn't mean it's true, though, Sky. It's logically possible that, humanity will go extinct, but we're not extinct today. So you can't know something about the current facts that's not true. So, like, for example, a person could never know that I'm 10 feet tall because it's just not the case. But a person could, I guess, let's say if they were on acid or mushrooms or some kind of hallucinogenic drugs and seeing things, maybe the person could, they could never know it because it's not correct. But a person could, if they're way off base, what's the other word that I'm trying to fish around for here? It's not possible as an item of knowledge, which requires accuracy and getting correct. But it's something that a person, I guess, if they're very weird and basically tripping, a person maybe could what? Not know that I am 10 feet tall, but what? Go ahead, let me know. Yeah, someone could possibly believe it, I guess. It'd be a weird thing for anybody to believe. I mean, I'm not particularly tall. I'm like an average 5'10" or whatever. But I guess someone might believe it if they were really misinformed or having hallucinations of some kind. Beliefs can be false, but knowledge cannot be false. Okay, you can have a false belief because you're misinformed or just completely out of whack, but you cannot know something false. Knowledge requires truth. Okay, let me give you another example which will help hopefully reinforce this point that no, you cannot know something false. You've taken so many tests in school, so this hopefully is relatable to you. Suppose one of those other classes where you might take a multiple choice test. Say you get a question on the test and it says, It's like history. It says, okay, I want you to circle the answer for the year where the Declaration of Independence was signed of the United States. And here are 4 options. A, 1776. B, 1876. C, 1976. Or D, 2025. Now you're the student. You look at these 4 options in the multiple choice. And let's say you figure, well, 2025, that seems a little late because that's the future. And it can't be signed in the future because this is a history class. So let me narrow it down to A, B, and C. And you're just totally unaware. You're like, I don't know. They all end with 76, and I've got no idea. So I guess whatever, B, 1876. Now, did that student know the answer to our question on the test? Will the teacher say, here's your credit because you knew the right answer? Did they have knowledge when they circled 1876? If you followed my example, the question was, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? And there were 4 options. Our student in hypothetical chooses B. Is that knowledge? No, it's not knowledge. But some people had just said that you can know things which are false. Not possible. If that was the case, then we would give people credit for false beliefs too. Anything you circle would be like, okay, it's knowledge. If it's true, if it's incorrect, it does not matter. Everything's knowledge, but it's not. Knowledge requires that you got the right answer, obviously. So who gets credited for the knowledge? The person who circles A. But we can even go a stage further in this. Suppose that the person who circles A was just guessing. Like suppose they're like, okay, I've narrowed it down to A and B because 1976 is still too soon. But I don't know anything about these 2 different centuries. I'm just going to take a wild guess. I'm 17, so I like that number better. I'm circling A. Now that student actually had the correct belief. So their belief that it was A was actually true. But they also didn't know it. And what's wrong in their case? Which condition are they missing? The student which guesses the right answer. I guess they'll be given credit by the teacher because the teacher can't possibly know why they circled it. So charitably, they get the credit. But they didn't really know the answer because in our case here, they don't have what? They had a belief. It was true, I guess, even if it was a guess. But they don't have what? In this new version of the example where the correct letter was circled, but just randomly. Why would you say that's not real knowledge of the answer? Why? Because it's missing one of the conditions for knowledge, which we're now learning about. And which one is it? Yeah, they did not have justification. So who actually knows the answer to the question? It's the student who fills in the correct answer, but when they do it, they're doing it not for a random reason, but because of all the information and evidence that they have, which indicates that that's the correct answer. So they could probably tell you all these other key dates and the lifespan of the key figures that were the framers to the Declaration. And that person who fills it in doesn't do it haphazardly or just on a hunch or anything else, but because of the information and evidence that they have. So it's not good enough for knowledge to just have a lucky guess that happens to be true. That's the point. Right now, suppose that I want to believe that there's an even number of human beings alive on the planet Earth. So it's a number divisible by 2. I don't know if that's true or not, but it very well might be true. It's got a 50% probability of being true, just because every whole number is either divisible by 2 or it isn't. So suppose I believe right now that there's an even number of people alive on the planet Earth. Maybe I'm right, but I don't know it. And why don't I know it? It's because even if I am right, it's not as if I have counted all the people or conducted a census, and therefore have no justification, which gives me probable cause to believe this is true. So, I mean, it might be true, but a 50-50 just random guess isn't the same thing as knowledge. Yeah, well, so Sky, you say some sort of feeling. I'm not sure the reference that you made there, but basically the thing that's missing in the case of our student who fills in the answer without any information about why is that they don't have justification. Take another case. You're a juror, and in walks the defendant that you have to make a decision about guilt or innocence. Suppose that this juror who sees the person immediately makes up their mind to vote of arguments because I've decided on day 1 they're guilty and I don't want to look at the evidence. Now, maybe that person is actually guilty. Suppose they are. Does this biased juror know it? Well, not really, because even though they believe they're guilty, and I guess given my hypothetical they don't have evidence yet that could indicate that they are guilty. So it's, again, not really knowing the case of guilt, but just having a lucky guess once again. So with knowledge, all 3 conditions have to be satisfied. If one of them isn't there, it's not good enough for knowledge. You can sometimes have a belief which is justified, and that's not true. That's another possibility. So suppose that you are the juror, and you did listen to the evidence, and the evidence made a very compelling case for the defendant being guilty. But suppose that although the evidence seems to indicate this, it's misleading evidence because the person was in fact framed by someone. So planted evidence was discovered, and it was interpreted to indicate guilt. If you're the juror who votes guilty based on that evidence, then you believe they're guilty, and you do have good reason for that belief. But in that case, we cannot say that you know the person is guilty because, according to the case given, they are not in fact guilty and they were framed. So all of these pieces have to be present. If one is missing, then that's not the case of knowledge. Some principles can be known without justification. True enough. I think that is perhaps true. Those are like ultimate propositions of logic, like the laws of non-contradiction and self-identity. For any A equals A. And it is not possible that both A and not A. Yes, there are some self-evident principles of logic. But we're talking about evidence usually that we find and discover in the ordinary course of life, not in like a theoretical logic or geometry context. But that's a reasonable, interesting point. So let me say this. I sometimes think about the definition of knowledge and the three parts that it has as somewhat similar to like the recipe for making an item in the kitchen. Suppose that for a cake, you would have to have sugar, flour, and water. I know in a real cake you need a few more things than that, but let's just suppose those are three necessary and sufficient ingredients. Well, the thing about them is each ingredient is necessary. You need water for the cake, you need flour for the cake, you need sugar for the cake, but by itself, without the other two ingredients, it's not enough to form it, right? So water by itself is not going to make a cake. It's just a bucket of water. Flour by itself, without the other ingredients, won't combine to make a cake. So these three things you can say are like the ingredients that bake the cake of knowledge. If you have one or two, that's great, but you need all three, otherwise it's not enough. Okay, so each of the ingredients are essential, and there will never be a cake without each one, but it's not going to be enough by itself if it doesn't occur alongside with the other two. Okay, so sometimes we have beliefs that are true and we got no reason to think so. If that's the case, we actually don't know it. Like if I believe there's aliens in outer space right now, there's a decent chance that that's true, but I don't have enough proof right now to say that I actually know this thing, even if it is already true. And in other cases, we have beliefs which are justified, but they turn out to be false. In a worst case scenario, we believe something false and we have no reason to think it's true. And in that case, we fail on two of the criteria. Clearly, you can't know something that you yourself don't believe. So if you don't have the belief condition satisfied, then that eliminates the possibility of knowledge in such a situation. Like if a person does not believe that the earth is round, then they don't know that the earth is round because they don't even think it is. So you have to at least think something's true to have the possibility of knowing it. But that's not enough. It has to also really be a fact, and you have to have good reasons to think so. Okay, so the definition of knowledge and some commentary about how it works. Now, there are a couple of different schools of thought about where most human knowledge comes from. There are these two famous kind of perspectives on that question. Where does most of our knowledge come from? So some people go with the school of thought called empiricism. Let me write this here. Two positions on human knowledge. So these are two different ways of thinking about where most of it comes from. One of them is empiricism, and compared against rationalism. So empiricism is the view that most human knowledge comes from the five senses and observation. Okay, so that's what it is. Most human knowledge comes from the five senses and observation. Okay, so the other view, rationalism here, it says that most human knowledge does not come from the five senses and observation, but instead it just comes from ideas, reason, and just abstract thought. So that's a different view. Most human knowledge Okay, so let me explain the differences here between these two viewpoints. So first with empiricism. Empiricists, those that adhere to this view, they do believe that most human knowledge comes from our five senses and what we can observe either directly or indirectly with the five senses. Now, the five senses, as you probably maybe know, are sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. Those five senses provide us with a whole wealth of information about what is happening around us in our environment and our placement relative to the things happening in our environment. So like if you just open your eyes and you look around you right now, you probably can see your local environment. And that's how, let's say, you know that you're in your home or at your dorm or wherever you may be right now, or apartment. And that's just one example. When you open your eyes and you look out and you see like a traffic accident, then you know that the accident has happened, and the knowledge is based on seeing it with your eyes. In other cases, other of the five senses give us information about the world. If you're walking around and you smell the smell of like barbecue, then you know someone in that area is doing a barbecue, not because you saw it, but because the olfactory sense of your nose can sense it in that way. Or maybe you smell smoke as you pass by an area where there seem to be fire trucks, and therefore you use the smell of smoke to infer that there's been a fire. So there's smell, there's sight, there's hearing. Okay, so like suppose that you didn't have vision, or just the fact that you do have vision is supplemented sometimes by what you can hear. So, I mean, if you heard the car crash and you heard this twisted metal, then you might know that there was a car accident even if you hadn't been able to visually see it. Or if you hear the fire engine and sirens blaring, then you might be able to know because of the hearing of that, that there's a fire nearby. Or if you hear a friend's voice, then you know that they're in the room with you even if you didn't see them yet. Okay, so hearing, smell, sight, taste, and touch. I guess with taste, you could know that there's like perhaps too much salt in the meal by the way that it tastes, or you could know of certain ingredients that may be in a given item of food through taste. Another possibility is touch, right? So say you're driving around and you know that your cell phone is somewhere on the passenger seat that's in the car with you. But you don't want to look over there while you're driving. You want to keep your eyes on the road. So you simply like fish your hand over here to the right and you feel around for something that has a distinctive contour and texture of the phone itself. Then when that is in your hand, you're like, okay, I know my phone is on that seat because I can feel it, even if I haven't sensed it with the other five senses. So anyway, I'm just giving you some common examples of how we learn about things in our world, in our environment, very fundamental and basic things through our five senses. If we didn't have the five senses, we would really be at a loss, because we wouldn't be able to use vision, taste, touch, hearing, or smell to learn about the things around us. Now, sometimes we also use tools to observe the world that enhance our ordinary powers of perception, like a telescope or a microscope can, of course, assist and enhance the powers of vision, just like a stethoscope can with the ear and so forth. So some people believe that that is where most of our knowledge comes from the things that we can discover through our five senses, either directly or indirectly. As an example of knowledge that's based on empirical evidence, meaning physical evidence that you can observe through your senses, take the case that dinosaurs exist. This is something that we know, but how do we know it? Well, we know it because of the fossils that we've been able to recover. That's the evidence that they existed. And these fossils are, of course, physically uncovered, excavated, carbon dated, and placed in like a museum or something. So if you want to know whether these things existed, you don't have to just guess or speculate. There's physical evidence that you can sense with the five senses. So some people, empiricists, they prioritize that as the main source of human knowledge. But opposed to them are rationalists. And rationalists say, no, actually, most human knowledge comes instead from just pure reason and ideas and abstract thinking. So with rationalism, think of the knowledge that you have of things like mathematics, geometry, pure logic, trigonometry. If I tell you that all the points that lie on the perimeter of a circle are equally distant from its radius, that's something that you know, but you don't have to get up and investigate anything. You don't have to like observe anything, see, taste, touch, smell, or feel anything. You just have to, like, in your mind's eye, contemplate the figure of a circle and then deduce its geometric properties just purely formally. And same with math, right? If you understand that the square root of 81 is 9, that doesn't require you to actually physically examine anything or use your five senses. You can understand that just as a pure mathematical concept in your head. So rationalism is sometimes like the armchair knowledge that you can get just from concepts. You can understand the law of transitivity in math, or the law of non-contradiction in logic, or certain facts about geometry, like all the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. And so for rationalists, that's where most of our human knowledge comes from. These folks would point out that the lower animals that are not humans, they also have the five senses and observation. But what distinguishes us from them is the way that we can apply formal concepts in our mind that animals don't understand. So anyway, there's these 2 points of view. In my own view, though, in my own opinion, really, I think the debate is a little bit overdone. In my own opinion, they're both important sources of knowledge which complement each other. I mean, some of our knowledge does come from the things that we can physically observe, and some of our knowledge just comes from pure formal concepts, like from logic and math. I would say that as a human being, we use both, and we get a lot out of both, but I don't know if I would prioritize or say that one kind of holds precedence over the other. But anyway, that's just a little lesson for you. Going back into the history of philosophy, you'll find that there have been those that passionately defend either side. The British empiricists of the 19th century, Mill, Hume, they're empiricists. And early modern philosophers from Europe, like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, they're more on the rationalist side. In my mind, anyway, like I said, they're both valuable and they both contribute to what we really have as knowledge. So, 2 positions on human knowledge. Okay, so from there, the next thing mentioned, or that I want to mention, is just some stuff about evidence, like basically what evidence is and what are some good basic sources of evidence. So evidence is just anything that can prove or disprove a claim. Okay, so evidence, something that proves or disproves a claim. Evidence is the stuff that it's kind of like a synonym for justification. You can also think of evidence as the premises within an argument, because premises are the reasons that support the conclusion of the argument. Evidence, something that proves or disproves a claim. You need to have evidence to have justification, and you need to have justification to have knowledge. So evidence is obviously a big part of the establishment of knowledge itself. And it's something that proves or disproves a claim. So like, suppose that, you're charging someone with driving under the influence. You're like a law enforcement officer. You can't just say, hey, they were drunk, and I don't need to prove it. Just take my word for it. No, you'd have to have some kind of proof. So, maybe if there was an open container in the car, or if they blew a breathalyzer with a sufficient value, you would say here to the court, these are facts that prove my claim, right, that the person was drunk. And that's just in a legal situation. But obviously, we don't just use evidence in those kind of scenarios. Suppose that you had a package that was stolen off of your doorstep, and you're like trying to find out who it was, and then you notice that there are footprints leading up to the package, and these footprints seem to match exactly like a friend of yours who wears a very distinctive shoe. So you might then say to the friend, I'm wondering, did you take my package because I could see, the footprint and it matches exactly your very unique shoe. So we need sometimes proof to back up a claim, and in other cases, we want evidence to disprove a claim. So like if a person says that the world is flat, I could disprove that with all kinds of evidence, like photographic evidence from satellites of the planet Earth, or from photos taken from the surface of the moon. There's also just inductive evidence, given the fact that every other celestial object out there is a sphere. Those would tend to be pieces of reason that disprove the claim that it's flat. So when you want to make a case for something, or make the case that something's false, you need evidence in order to do that. What are some very basic sources of evidence? Okay, so let me write that here. Some basic sources of evidence, things that we would use to give ourselves the justification that we want. So one of the most basic sources of evidence is just direct experience. Being there, seeing, witnessing, experiencing something firsthand. That's probably about the strongest evidence that you could have, So if you were there at the scene and you saw Jones commit murder, then your evidence that he did it is just the actual experience of having seen it yourself. and so it wouldn't be like collecting data from the crime scene forensically or anything else. Can proof be based on probability or certainty? Well, I would say this, guy, it's usually based on probability because it's hard to have proof that is so strong that there's absolutely no possibility that it could be invalidated. So usually we think about evidence in terms of degree of confirmation, like the evidence raises the likelihood that the claim it's basing is true. But to raise the likelihood to a full 100% is usually very hard. Even in law, we don't insist on no ability to doubt, but just proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So to answer your question, it's probably best to say it's based on probability, but certainty is the goal, and we just try to reach for it as much as we can. So direct experience, that's one basic source of evidence, like I was saying. Another case is testimony. So testimony is just evidence that is based on what other people either tell you or report to you in writing. So it could be that you receive a text from somebody who's at school. Imagine that we still have physical school, okay? And the person says, hey, don't come to school today. There's been a fire at school and they've canceled class, so we all have to evacuate. Now, in that case, you might learn about the events, but not by having been there. In this case, you're just learning secondhand from someone else who is there, and they notify you through the text or through a phone call. Testimony is another source of evidence. When you're not there, you need to rely on testimony. And in fact, it's huge because we can't be there for lots of stuff. How about the entirety of human history in the past? You know, I talked about the Declaration being signed in 1776, and that's something that you and I both know. But how do we know it? Because we couldn't have experienced it since it happened hundreds of years ago. The reason that we know is because we've read these accounts in books and in classes where we've studied the material, and those books that have been written are the recorded writings that survive through the generations that get passed on to a new group in the next generation. So books that encode facts and content can also be seen as pieces of testimony that are saved and preserved. Sometimes it's testimony through actual speech that you hear. In other cases, it's written messages, media messages, political statements, etc. But it can also just be in an everyday case, like I mentioned. Someone texts you to notify you of something. Now that's your evidence. If someone asked you, how do you know there was a fire? In the case I mentioned, you couldn't say, well, I was watching it and I smelled the smoke. But you could say, well, I got a text and that's my evidence that it happened. Okay, so then beyond testimony and direct experience, there's also memory and inference. Okay. Now, memory is really just very much the same as experience, except this difference. It's experiences that are stored in the mind for later recall and later review. So, like, for example, right now, you, I'm assuming, will know what you had for dinner last night, right? I think you know that. If I asked you, what did you have for dinner last night, you'd be able to tell me, and you'd say it with confidence because you know it. But how do you know it? What's your evidence? It cannot be that you're experiencing last night's dinner right now because it's last night's over with. And it's not that anyone texted you or told you, hey, here's what you had for dinner. I mean, I guess if you had amnesia or something, you might need people to constantly remind you of things, like the movie Memento. But obviously, in ordinary life, we have memory that we don't need to rely on other people's testimony of our own dinner. So it is your memory. You can simply go back in your mind's eye, think to the scene and setting of last night, and there you'll be able to retrieve access to the previously experienced events. So like the mind can capture and record sense perception for the ability to later reflect on. If we didn't have memory, we'd always be at a loss. We'd be constantly wondering, how did we get here? What happened before? So our memory preserves information and evidence that we've collected from whatever source, either testimonial or direct experience, for later retrieval. And Sky, you said, can testimony prove something unnatural like miracles? Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. Of course, the scriptures do attest to biblical stories where there are miracles that were performed. But, you know, in a moment I was going to get to this. Sometimes you have sources of evidence that contradict each other, okay? Sometimes one source of evidence will appear to boost a claim, but another contradictory piece of evidence seems to contradict that. And when there are contradictions among your various evidence sources, you then have to make a decision about which one to prioritize or which one you think is more reliable. For example, okay, in Christian scripture, you know, it talks about a resurrection of Jesus, like he came back from the dead after he was crucified. But if you look at science and biology, it will tell you that it's not possible for a living organism to return to life after its vital functions have ceased. So now you have two different pieces of testimony, one from the scientific reference and one from the spiritual scriptures. And I guess it's then up to you to judge which is the more reliable source of testimony, since they're claiming opposite things. In a more limited case, Sky, and to anybody else, since the interesting point, you can also receive conflicting testimony from two people, right? One person says, hey, there's a fire at school, don't come. Another friend texts you 5 minutes later, they're like, had you heard about this rumor? People said there was a fire, but it was just a rumor, lol, there's still school. Now you heard two different people, and they're saying opposite things. Now you have to be the one that breaks the tie and uses your own judgment to weigh whose testimony you think is more credible, okay? So in life, unfortunately, it's not always so simple and straightforward, like all the evidence sources corroborate each other. In the best case scenario, multiple sources of evidence will all reinforce each other and align. And that's when you have the best justification possible. But in some cases, your evidence in one source will conflict with evidence from another source, and that's where you do have to make judgments about how to prioritize them. Okay, one more though was inference, and we'll just finish with this. When you have inference evidence, that's just drawing conclusions based on other related facts. So like take the case where I said you see someone's footprint, and you're like a forensic investigator trying to determine who the killer is. So you take a photo of that footprint and you compare it to like all the database of what different type of shoes and what footprints they leave. And then that might help you make an identification of who purchased such a shoe, like in the local area, right? If you go back into like banking and retail sale records. Now, if you infer that like Jones is the killer because you saw a shoe print and it matches a distinctive shoe of Jones, that is evidence that's not based on being there and seeing the crime yourself. If there were no other witnesses, then it's not based on any other witness testimony. And of course, if neither of those is the case, then there's no memories that you'll have access to. But you can infer this conclusion from other facts. Like if you heard the sirens on the fire engine, that's not being there seeing the fire or hearing from someone that it happened, nor is it memory, but it's inferring the existence of the fire from the sign that you hear as a siren. So we use evidence in all these different sources to form a conception of the world and what's happening in it, and to have knowledge. So since knowledge requires evidence and justification, these are some of the primary sources that you could use. And if you have more than one of these that backs the others up, then that just reinforces your credibility and justification for the belief even more. Okay, so I guess here's the thing. We're done with today's time. So when we come back on Thursday, we'll try our best to get through as much of the rest of chapter 4 as we can. We'll talk a little bit about what are some unreliable sources of evidence. We will talk about what are some resources to use when you're doing research. And we'll also talk a little bit about what are some common perceptual and cognitive errors that people can make when they try to process information, so that we can do our best to avoid making those errors. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks again, everyone, for your help and participation. If you're good to go and everything's all right, then let me know in the chat, and then I'll just close the stream as soon as I can see you are there. So are we all right? All good to go? Let me know. Yeah, just asking. Okay, thanks so much, guys. Perfect. Have a great one. And again, if you're looking for the grade on your quiz or first homework, just email me anytime and I'll do my best to get back to you within 2 days. Okay, thanks again and have a great one. I'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.